I know our time is of the essence, but I do want to give you some information about Dodge Billingsley that may not be on the flyer. Dodge began covering war in 1993 in the Republic of Georgia and has lived in and traveled in both separatist regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, extensively since 1993. He founded Combat Films and Research in 1997 and has since spent much of his time continuing to document numerous global hotspots, including Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Chechnya, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Western China, and Iraq, splitting his time between producing documentaries, writing, and lecturing. If you go to the website, you can see most of those previous lectures here. His documentaries include Beyond the Border, a series of 6 films of international scope that he produced for the Kennedy Center. They began airing in fall 2004 and in spring 2005. You can find more about those on beyondtheborder.org. His film House of War won the Rory Peck Award and the Royal Television Society Award for Best Feature, documenting the battle for Kwalajangi Fortress in Afghanistan, where he was one of the few foreigners on hand for the prison revolt that took the life of CIA agent Mike Spann. He was among the few to document the U.S.-led Operation Anaconda in Afghanistan, the Shah-e-Kot Valley, air assaulting into the valley with soldiers from the 101st Air Assault Division. He's currently writing a book and a documentary on the operation commissioned by the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies Office. His films have been shown on CNN, Discovery Channel, Military Channel, the History Channel, and in PBS in the States. And he's produced work for BBC, Channel 4 UK, NHK, Japan, and elsewhere. He's the past recipient of the MacArthur Foundation's Regional Security Travel Grant for his work on Georgia-Abkhazia and has lectured on various security-related topics for the U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, and Air Force, the New York Military Association, and a number of other academic institutes, including Columbia University's Harriman Institute, King's College London, Monterey Institute, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Arizona, and so on. Frequent contributor to various defense and security-related journals, including Jane's Intelligence Review, the Journal of Electronic Defense, and the Harriman Review. Billingsley received a BA in History from Columbia University and an MA in War Studies from King's College Department of War Studies in London. Very pleased today to welcome Dodge Billingsley. As I mentioned previously, the title of his topic, Ossetia in Perspective, Georgia Plays Russian Roulette. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Dodge Billingsley.
Thanks, Corey. It's a pleasure to be back here at BYU. I see some familiar faces, and that's nice. Thanks for coming. There's a lot of new faces. I hope it purely wasn't a class assignment that you have to show up. I think what's going on in Ossetia and in Georgia and in the region itself, the Caucasus, is very interesting. And as I walked, just getting ready to start, Lee Simon came up because you're going to tell us who started this whole thing, aren't you? We'll try. We'll try. The new information comes out almost daily, and it's been really interesting to follow it. In fact, my notes are. My outline is so covered in notes of just things that are sort of being revealed in the last day or two that it's almost hard to keep a sense of it myself. But if I were to summarize the conflict in Ossetia, I would say it's characterized by Georgian Ossetian mutual hostility, a Georgian advance or assault to retake the separatist enclave, finally a Russian counter-assault, a counterstrike against Georgian units, also moving into Georgia proper, attacking all the general military infrastructure within Georgia. Finally, separatist recognition that these states are independent by Russia, and a mixed response from the West. So with that said, I want to point out that first, I don't think we should consider Georgia's war, and I call it a 6-day war, beginning on August 7th, from the first blows to August 12th, when Russian aircraft stopped their final, sort of wrapped up their military objectives. But that 6-day war should not be seen of as an anomaly or something that's unique to itself. In reality, there's been a long history of incompatibility between the Ossetians and the Georgians. The Ossetians are Persian people. They speak a Farsi-like dialect. They just happen to have landed there centuries ago in some way or another, and they're there. In 1918 to 1920, the South Ossetians, revolted against Georgian rule. That was eventually put to rest with the within the Soviet Union. But in 1989, prior to the dissolving of the Soviet Union, South Ossetia made calls for reunification with North Ossetia. And you can barely see it there. There's a map of Georgia, and South Ossetia is the separatist enclave in the center. You'll see the capital, Tbilisi, is marked. Literally, South Ossetia is just down the road from the Georgian capital. And so when you heard the news reports about Russian forces advancing to Gori or moving south from South Ossetia, they're within a half-hour's drive from the Georgian capital. Also, you will see lightly shaded there the territory of North Ossetia. So that's the ancestral Ossetian homeland. It straddles the Russian-Georgian border. And so it's not that they're like cousins, right? They are the same people in North Ossetia and South Ossetia. The capital of North Ossetia is Vladikavkaz. And so again, even though there's a border there, this is one ethnic group that is in control of North and South Ossetia. In 1990, just to give you a little bit of the history, and you may already know it, Georgia elects President Zviad Gamsakhurdia, an ultra-nationalist, to become their first president. He immediately declares, South Ossetia immediately declared itself a Soviet republic separate from Georgia. President Gamsakhurdia responded by sending in nationalist militiamen. And if you look in 1991, the USSR collapses. Georgia declares itself independent and then abolishes the South Ossetian Autonomous Republic. A war is fought in which, in the end, the Ossetians retain their ancestral homeland in Georgia. And I put these two figures up here, Tengiz Kitovani and Zava Ioselani. And if you were at my lecture months ago about whether Georgia was eligible or should be eligible for NATO membership, you remember I talked about these leaders. They represent the militiamen that sort of represented the Georgian military effort in the early 90s. Kitovani is a sculptor and turned national director or head of the National Guard, and Ioselani ran a group called the Mekhedrioni, or the Horsemen. It was really, you could call it a bandit formation. They were loosely affiliated with the Georgian government, but in the end actually fought out a big battle in the capital, Tbilisi, against the Georgian president for power. So these are the kind of troops that Georgia sent in, because what's interesting about this war in Ossetia in 1991-92 is that it's characterized by lots of reports of Russian interference, but also by equal reports of Georgian incompetence, military incompetence and military bungling in the area. In the mid-90s, a ceasefire agreement is made, which allows for 500 Russian peacekeepers to be permanently deployed in South Ossetia, and up to 300 more be put in case of emergency. And this is orchestrated under the Shevardnadze's watch. And it's interesting, you might think, okay, how can Russian peacekeepers be the peacekeepers if they're sort of involved in the conflict in some way? And that's the great issue in Georgia. In both Abkhazia, the other separatist region, and Ossetia, you have CIS peacekeepers. Shevardnadze was forced to sign these CIS agreements because I think he understood what it meant being part of the old Soviet bureaucracy himself, the Soviet political machine, and having KGB roots. I think he understands what it means to be in power next to great Russia. Russia is your great neighbor to the north, and you have to think that into all your foreign policy and almost your domestic policy decisions. And so Shevardnadze, I think, was good at doing that. It didn't help him, as far as popularity, because everybody wanted, in Georgia, these areas, they wanted them back. But I think he understood the reality. In 1996, of course, the Organization for Security and Cooperation, they come in and they put monitors. Again, this is on Shevardnadze's initiative. He knew he couldn't kick out Russian CIS peacekeepers. But if he could bring in the West somehow, he could try to minimize power from Russia or the influence of Russia by co-balancing that with Western non-governmental institutions like the UN. In Abkhazia, you have UNAMIG, the United Nations Observer Mission Group in Georgia. In Ossetia, you have the OSCE and their observer mission. And so that was how he sort of was trying to get just Western influence in and minimize or just push back Russian influence. But the fact of the matter is the monitors were never armed. They were not peacekeepers. They were strictly monitors, and they always were sort of side by side with Russian peacekeepers who were very well armed. And seen as very much on the side of the Ossetians or the Abkhaz. In 2003 is the Rose Revolution. Shevardnadze is gone. President Saakashvili takes power, and he's officially elected in 2004. I think Saakashvili is the more slick version of Zviad Gamsakhurdia. He's an ultranationalist, and he came to power in many respects on this rhetoric that he will regain the separatist territories, as realistic as that may or may not be. But 2004, the same year that Saakashvili is elected, there's a dramatic increase in violence in South Ossetia. And it kind of illustrates something I think happens a lot. If I would characterize the struggle in the separatist regions, I would say that every summer is the fighting season, that this violence spikes almost every summer from 1992 when the initial violence took place to the current summer. In the winter and fall, these events die off. That said, though, there's been a number of bomb attacks in South Ossetia. And of course, they blame each other. The Georgians, of course, blame banditry on the Ossetian side or Russian intrigue for causing it. Of course, the Ossetians blame the Georgians, but all the events take place in Skinvali, in Ossetian territory. And again, if you heard the last lecture on Abkhazia, Georgian militia groups, or we might call them insurgent groups, or even terrorist groups like Tetrageorgi, Forest Brothers, White Legion, these groups operate autonomously of the government in Tbilisi, but most Ossetians, Abkhaz, and Russians feel they couldn't operate without at least support or tacit approval from the government in Tbilisi, carrying out these kind of attacks in Abkhazia. So, leading to the Six-Day War. I guess I wanted to bring that up because, again, I don't think we should consider this something that just happened. This war's been going on since 1990, and you could even say longer than that, but actual blood has been shed since 1990 in this area of South Ossetia. The Six-Day War, I put a few things up there. Fighting between Georgian and Ossetian units on August 7th. We're going to get to who started it, Lee, I promise. It's not that easy to sort out. In fact, I won't even claim I have it sorted out. But I just want to give you a little bit of a rundown on what I want to cut some of these things out, but what happened. On the 7th, the fighting erupts. The Georgians actually call for a ceasefire. On television, Saakashvili goes on TV calling for a ceasefire. They observe a 3-hour ceasefire with the intent that the Ossetian civilians can leave the capital. So in a way, the ceasefire is a nice ethnic cleansing move because if you can convince the Ossetians to move out of the capital, then Georgia can then move in and take the capital, but it's an Ossetian capital. Russia also calls an emergency meeting at the UN calling for the fighting to cease between Georgians and Ossetians. On the 7th, or possibly the 8th, Russian armored units start to move in from the north, and this is disputed, and we'll talk about that later. By the 8th, Georgia declares Skinvali 70% freed. Again, free of what? Free from themselves? This is an Ossetian city with only Ossetians. There might be the mixed marriage here and there, but this is not a ethnic Georgian city. It's an Ossetian city. And I think that's one thing that gets lost in the rhetoric now. It has become a Georgian-Russian conflict, or even a Russia global conflict. But in the end, it's it's an Ossetian-Georgian conflict. And if you take the Russians out of the equation, you take the West, you still have this animosity between these two groups. On the 9th, the port of Poti is bombed. Poti is clear and then the targets in Gori are bombed as well. And if you look through there, you can see that the Russian military campaign really starts stepping it up. And in the end, if you look at the costs of war, different figures, of course. Georgia, you look at the wide discrepancy between number of Georgians said to be killed. And the Russians claim they killed 3,000 Georgian military and police. And that the Georgians have gone into a sort of a massive campaign of denials that's sort of like not, so that the population wouldn't realize how big the assault really was. Of course, Russian and Ossetian KIA I think is way overstated, but I'm not sure. It's really hard to sort out. This is not going to be easy to sort. But what's interesting is the scope of the Russian attacks. They go from Ossetia in the center, Skinvali being the capital, to Gori, to Sanaki, to Poti, and they're over in the military bases here, Merneli and Bolnisi, and they even are in Batumi and elsewhere. It's a pretty wide, okay, let's see. This was taken off the Georgian Ministry of Defense site, and the little red blasts indicate the scope of the attacks, even down as far as Batumi in the west, all clear over to the east. Also, which may have been lost, but probably not, or maybe not well understood, is that the Russians were also assisting in Abkhazia. And if you look at the little diamonds, that's the show of Russian units at the close of the war. You see they're almost completely out of South Ossetia. They pushed themselves down out of Ossetia proper, out of South Ossetia into Georgia proper. Gori, the tremendous amount of attacks on Gori, and again, you see how close Tbilisi is. In Abkhazia, the only Georgian posts or military positions in Georgia were up in the Kadori Valley, and you'll see there was a number of strikes there. Russian units have moved in and moved again south of the militarized zone there, taking the fight into the Georgia proper. The war's aftermath. I'm kind of racing through this a little bit because I know we got to be out by 1, and I hope we can get into a discussion. The immediate aftermath, there was a ceasefire on the 12th. It was signed by Russians on the 16th. But on the 20th, Russia revealed this buffer zone concept. And again, the concept is pulling these units south of the areas, and they would be permanently deployed there. Well, that's not acceptable to Georgia nor the international community. At least let's get back to the status quo, where Russian units that are peacekeepers are back within the separatist territories. And so the idea is that the Russians will pull out by the 15th, of which they're partially out, and the EU monitors will move into the buffer zone again, bringing in European Union monitors, so they can, because the Russians are wanting guarantees that the Georgians will not attack again. So they want this buffer zone. So in great credit to French President Sarkozy, who was the acting EU president at this time, he's negotiated, gone back and forth, tirelessly negotiating the end of this conflict. But again, the real question, who started the war? It's a great question. I guess I want to say one thing. You know, was Georgia baited? It's baited into this. It's tough to say. I mean, there's been a lot made of the fact that the Russian units seem to be able to move on a dime to get into Georgia. But and it's almost as if the analysts are saying, well, Georgian army, it's terrible. Well, you know, it was terrible. When it hit Chechnya in 1994-95, it was a pretty demoralized army, but it's gotten a lot better and a lot better under Putin. And if you look at Russian soldiers and they don't wear their body armor, someone will wear tennis shoes, somebody will have a gun that doesn't, you know, function, doesn't necessarily mean they don't have to measure up to U.S. standards. You know, where everybody's got ballistic helmet, ballistic eyewear. I mean, force protection is the name of the game in the U.S. In Russia, they have bodies to throw at these conflicts, and they throw them at these conflicts. And in the end, this is not Chechnya. This is the Georgian. Not to belittle the Georgian, you know, military might, but this is not Chechnya. Armed with U.S., Ukrainian, and Israeli weaponry is different from being tenacious and pragmatic and fighting a war for entirely different reasons. So with that, though, let's examine some of the discussions. The Georgians claim, and you may have read this some of this in the New York Times, that they intercepted telephone calls that show that the Russians were crossing the Roki Tunnel. This is a picture of the Roki Tunnel, and that's the Russian-Georgian border. They claim that the Russians were crossing the Roki Tunnel on the early morning hours, or early on the 7th, before Georgia started shelling Skin Valley, so even before the conflict began. Western intelligence has determined independently that 2 battalions of the Russian 135th Regiment did move through the tunnel earlier on the night of August 7th, or late in the night of August 7th, or early morning of August 8th. That's all that kind of been revealed at this point. They also show additional Western intelligence emerged, showing that a motorized rifle element was assigned to actually guard the north entrance and to secure that. And then they were put through to secure the southern end and then sent on to Skin Valley. But interestingly enough, this unit didn't get to Skin Valley till the next night, on the 9th. And they said because they faced heavy fighting with the Georgians. The Georgians denied that. They didn't deny that there was heavy fighting. They just denied it when it took place. They said it took place on the 7th, the day before. So I don't know. And the fact is, I don't know if we'll ever, I mean, we probably will know as more and more comes out. I guess the point I want to make about it is, did Russia pre-plan this? Georgia had been attacking for more than a week. Russia mobilizes their troops a lot. So even if I'm going to be, if I give Russia the benefit of the doubt, they had more than a week before the 7th, start mobilizing, because the Georgians had already forced, on like August 1st, the Georgians had mortared Skin Valley and killed 8 people. They had also pushed the Russian peacekeepers off the heights to the east of the city a whole week before the conflict officially started. That's ample time for Russia to fire up the 58th Army, who's just based in Vladikavkaz, and also to bring the airborne troops in. So it's an interesting question. I don't know if we'll get it sorted out yet, who actually started. I mean, again, I would think that this conflict is just a serious escalation of something that's been going on for a lot longer than that. What's interesting about the tunnel is there's been a lot of debate. Why didn't the Georgians, I mean, myself included, on the first day, why didn't they seize the tunnel? Why did they just circle the city of Skin Valley and start blasting the civilian center? Because Russia made huge claims of genocide, which have turned out to be mostly fabricated and overblown. But the fact of the matter was, Georgia was using multiple rocket launch systems and other forms of artillery and airstrike to hit Skin Valley, which is a civilian center. If you do that, you're going to kill civilians. That's just the way it is. So why did they do that? Why did they leave the tunnel? Well, it appears that they did fight at the tunnel. Now more and more evidence shows that Georgians made at least 3 or 4 different stabs along between the tunnel and down the Skin Valley. along that windy road to actually secure the route. Again, this is the only land route from Russia to South Ossetia, the only one. So you would not be able to move Russian armor into South Ossetia unless you come across the Black Sea and move clear across Georgia. Now you can air assault, and Russia did air assault into Skin Valley, but you're talking about light infantry. Light infantry helicopter assault in against Georgian tanks and armor should have been easy work for the Georgians. But the Russian armor coming in as well, so being a two-pronged assault, that kind of turned the tide immediately. The other thing is that we just happened to be in Azerbaijan and elsewhere a week after the war, interviewing Chechens, and we started hearing about the Chechens talking about the Vostok Special Unit. And I know about the Vostok Unit. It's based in Gudermes, Chechnya. They're all former fighters against Russia, but they've turned to the other side, and they're led by a guy named Yamadayev. Well, it turns out that Russia sent in the Vostok Unit, one of the first units. So the first unit attacking was this pro-Moscow-based Chechen unit. And if you see on the side of their BMP, if any of you read Russian, you see the word Vostok, and it says Yamadayev's men. So these are captured Georgian vehicles they seized in the initial stages of the battle, and then they just graffitied them all over to show who they were. And the guy in the middle holding up his finger is the Chechens have always used that as a symbol because it's closer to the Arabic script for the word Allah. And the Chechens will always do that, one finger up, meaning Allah. So the Chechens were there. Also, the Georgians were said to have deployed another 500 troops from another brigade, again on different parts of the road, and they were repelled at Java and Gupta. So things we didn't know 2 or 3 weeks ago, or 2 or 3 weeks after the initial fighting on the 7th, have come to light. And I have a feeling you'll have more of this stuff come to light, which means really determining who started the war probably won't be known, and it'll be one of those things, how are you going to define the start of the war? It's really, in a way, becomes irrelevant. The more relevant thing, I think, is perhaps why. Why escalate now? As I mentioned before, Saakashvili, he came to power and has remained in power in large part because of his platform and his rhetoric, I will take back the separatist regions. He also, as you remember, Georgia's on that, they want the membership action plan to NATO, and they want NATO membership. Part of the hang-up for NATO membership is they don't even control their own borders. They don't control their own territorial integrity issues. Maybe Saakashvili felt if he could grab back one of the separatist regions, it would look good and help expedite this NATO issue. I don't know. But also, one thing, and there's many things, you can go, there's probably dozens of reasons, possible rationales. Maybe he thought the West would run or really come to his aid. It's hard to say. But the one thing I will say that's a positive for the Georgian side of the conflict is this escalation has put Georgia, Ossetia, and Abkhazia back on the world map. I mean, really, nobody remembered this. After 9/11, for us, we forget all about these types of things. But this put this issue over separatism back on the map. Now, maybe it'll be fleeting, maybe it will go nowhere. But I have a feeling that it's going to be more than that. And in that sense, it could be considered somewhat of a Georgian success to get this conflict back on the world agenda if they're able to do that. For the Russian side, well, of course, they've made no bones about it. They do not want Georgia or Ukraine nor anyone else to be in those areas on their immediate border to become members of NATO. And they said that's a really bad thing. They fought hard against the missile defense shield in Azerbaijan, and as a result of this conflict, the Poles and the U.S. signed an agreement to put missile defense capabilities in Poland. And the Russians said there will be an immediate counter to that if these missiles are deployed. It's really only half an argument, though, because to put these missiles in for them to launch, you need a wide offset. The radars have to be based in the Czech Republic, or the missiles won't hit any targets. And Czech Republic has yet to actually sign a deal and agree to keeping the missile radars. So right now, it's just political rhetoric. No radars, you can fire the missile all you want, they're not going to hit anything. But also, I think there's two other things. Russia, I think, smarts from the high-handedness in which they were treated by the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is not the same Russia of drunken Boris Yeltsin. This is Putin. He's an idol, and he's very popular in Russia. I mean, this guy, he's smart, he's young, he's strong, he doesn't drink in a society where most men die of alcoholism in their mid-50s. I mean, he is very popular in Russia. He's put the pride back in the Russian Federation, and that's good for Russia. It's good for every country to have that pride in themselves, and Putin's done that. And I think they feel a smarting a little bit for things that they felt like they lost at the end and the disrespect from which they were treated. Again, that's kind of a social look at the thing. But, and finally, the Kosovo question. They declared Ossetia and Abkhazia independent. They told us when the U.S. said we want Kosovo to be independent for special reasons, Russia fought this and fought this and fought this. And special reasons for us, maybe, but not for the Russians. And it's tit for tat. We declare Kosovo independent. They go with, they declare South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I mean, if you look at the targets, the Russian attack, I think, had multiple audiences. First, Georgian, obviously. They don't want Georgia to be a NATO member. They don't like the Georgia train and equip mission, the military ties that we have with Georgia. They're a little annoyed at the ties to Israel and their arms dealing. And they want to control the resources in that region. And as you know, there's 2 big pipelines that go through Georgia out of Baku, Azerbaijan. I think that's also intent over the attack was geared toward NATO to show what the Russia's willing to do. It's geared toward the European Union that's seeking to make Ukraine as well part of these organizations, and it's geared toward everyone. And one of the most significant things, being in the region a week after the conflict, was talking to Azeris and part of the SOCAR state-owned oil company, and some foreign ministry people and journalists, is that they were just like, whoa, if Russia can do this to Georgia, what are they going to do to us? What can they do to us? I mean, it's like they know they have to sort of fall in line. And again, looking at the Western response to this, it looks fairly muddled. I mean, I have great respect for the French president for all his efforts to put this thing together. But our response and the global, in general, what is it? It wasn't very strong. If you think of issues of policy, I think of hypocrisy, genocide, the Russians saying, oh, it's a genocide against the Ossetians. So how can you say that when you kill 100,000 Chechens? In just north, territorial integrity. We talk about how bad it is to declare Ossetia and Abkhazia, yet we do the same in Serbia over in Kosovo. I mean, both sides are guilty of this. And finally, disproportional response. A lot was made of disproportional response. In other words, you attack Ossetia, we flatten your military structure. The response against the Serbs, our response against the Serbs for their violations in Kosovo was a 47-day bombing campaign. Was that disproportional? I mean, it's hard for us to go at them on equal footing and say, you've violated all these things, you've done this, you've engaged in disproportional response when we are guilty of the same things, or we have done the same things. Maybe guilty is not the right word to use. But again, on international response, I think the biggest problem is, there's been a number of things that have fallen out. The Ukrainian situation is very interesting because right as the conflict started, the Russians and the Ukrainians there was a lot of negative rhetoric towards one another on the 7th and 8th. There was one strategic bomber shot down, Russian strategic bomber, a backfire bomber, that was shot down by an S-200 surface-air missile system, which is a Ukrainian system. Also, the Ukrainians said that they would block the Russian Black Sea Fleet from re-entering Sevastopol in the Crimea. And that pissed the Russians off as well. Oh, sorry, I keep saying that. That annoyed the Russians as well. And clean that up when I go home here. And what's more alarming is that the Ukrainian government is now in a state of sort of disarray because they're trying to figure out how to deal with and work with Russia. What will be the Western response? The Crimea, the base for the Black Sea Fleet, is set. It's basically loaned to Russia. They have a loan on that till 2017. In 2017, Ukrainians have said they will not renew the lease at 2017. So my feeling is this is not just a Georgian response to Georgia to show Georgia. It's a response to everybody in the region and to the globe that they're back. And I think that this will not be a one-off. I don't think that Azerbaijan will be the next target. I think Azerbaijan will walk a fine line between the West and Russia. But I think you'll see increased problems in Ukraine. Already, one of the instruments of coercion the Russians have used is they've issued Russian passports to Ossetians living in Georgia, to Abkhaz living in Georgia, in Georgian territory. They're also now finding that these Ukrainian citizens of Russian ethnic descent have Russian passports. This is very disconcerting to the Ukrainian government because it's the same pretext from which they basically went to, one of the general pretexts they went to war by saying they're protecting Russian citizens. 90% of Ossetians are technically Russian citizens carrying Russian passports because Russia started feeding these passports into these people. And they're doing that to the Russian populations in Ukraine, which makes you wonder. They need the base for the Black Sea Fleet. They don't want Ukraine to be a NATO country, and they're starting to put passports and change the visa regimes for Ukraine. If Ukraine doesn't fall in line, you can only assume that Ukraine has a very large, but it could work into a shooting war, or you might lose eastern Ukraine, which is heavily Russian, ethnic Russian. So in the end, and I'm going to stop so that we can maybe discuss something, I really think the U.S. and the West needs a new containment strategy toward Russia. I don't think we have much leverage. Europe has been, the response has been very mixed politically and economically. 33% of all energy, of all the oil going to Europe comes from Russia. And you saw in the last couple of years, they've turned the pipelines off to Georgia, to Ukraine. They basically played energy extortion with Europe. And more power to them. They have the money, they have the oil, and they have the natural gas. And Europe is dependent on it. So there won't be anything strong coming out of Europe because they're basically saying, I'm going to change my whole way of life and go to war for 5 million Georgians. It's not going to happen. It'll never happen. Why would you, if you're the president of any large Western European state, do that? You just wouldn't do it. So there has to be some other sort of trigger. And I don't know. It's very, 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 very unpopular to say let's drop a brigade of the 82nd Airborne down on the border of Abkhazia and Ossetia. But I don't know what kind of tripwire, short of the old Cold War tripwire, where it's basically a military tripwire, that you might actually get any real sort of pause to Russian movement. I really don't think, again, I don't think the Georgian thing is a one-off. I think it's the beginning of, it's not even the beginning. It's just another step in basically reasserting its power and sphere of influence. They've said that. They've no bones about it, that that's their intent. They want those territories back in actuality, or at least an influence, and they're very, very negative against things like going into NATO and getting into those alliances. So again, I don't know what's going to happen, but I really feel like it's a time, again, when George Kennan wrote the containment doctrine in it was 1950 or 1949, we're facing a new kind of containment issue, and we have no real leverage. But I think that's more and more what we face. In the end, I would just say that what's at stake? Russia, again, it's reasserting itself in its sphere of influence. But we're looking at the future orientation, political orientation of the Caucasus and Eastern Europe. What's going to happen in this place in the next decade and a half, next 2 decades? NATO and EU relevance. How relevant is NATO? I mean, you could say that they are failing in Afghanistan when only a couple of nations, Britain, Canada, and the U.S., take the hits, go to the southeast, go to the places where there's real fighting going on, where most of the other NATO member states don't want any part of that shooting war, and they're up in the north, and they're in PRTs in the far west. Their credibility is on the line as well now in the Caucasus and perhaps in Eastern Europe. And again, U.S. interest in the region and its superpower relations with Russia. Again, I think we're obviously moving into a new chapter because we're going to have a new president soon, a new administration, a new outlook, a new orientation ourselves. At the same time, we're facing a Russia that's more emboldened, more powerful, more wealthy, and more sure of itself than ever before, at least since the end of the Cold War. I mean, threatening Russia that he can't be in the G8 or, left out some big deal. And they basically said that you need us more than we need you. That doesn't do anything to us. We got a gazillion petrodollars and we'll use them how we want. That's not a threat. I think I'll close with that and open up to questions because I think we got to be out of here in about 12 minutes. So thank you very much. I just sort of rapid fire through that. I apologize, but please, if there's any questions or discussions, let's go. Yeah.
Just want to wait for the mic, and then just let us know your name and your major.
Hi, my name is Justin. I'm double majoring in Russian and business, and pre-business. I just had a question. I just got back from a mission to Ukraine, where I served in the eastern part. And many of the Ukrainians there that I talked to anticipate something similar to what happened in Georgia, just as you talked about. And it goes far deeper than Russia just issuing them passports. It goes to the point of the Western Ukrainians forcing nationalistic things with them speaking Ukrainian throughout all their school systems and having Ukrainian in movie theaters, even when it's Russian films, they're being translated into Russian. And it should be known also that the Crimea is also, it's an autonomous republic, as far as I know. So my question, I guess, to you is if you could put a time frame on it, if we could estimate the inevitable, the switch, the difference between Eastern and Western Ukraine.
Wow, that's a good question, and I guess if we all knew that was for sure the outcome, maybe our foreign policy would start being shaped by it immediately. I would say a good benchmark would be 2017 when the Crimea lease comes up. When the Black Sea basing rights come up for renegotiation. But my feeling is, it will probably, things will come to a head probably before that. But I think it's hard to say because it depends on the whole global response. And there's a possibility, and this is, we're talking years out, and this is far-fetched in a way, but there's a very distinct possibility Ukraine could be split. The West is very nationalistic, you're right. And the fact that the West, during the fighting in Abkhazia and in Ossetia in the 1990 to 92 war and those wars, that period, Ukrainian volunteers, I wouldn't say flocked over in the hundreds, but in the dozens to fight the Russians and Abkhaz and Ossetians, what they considered Russian moves. And there's Ukrainian groups like UNSO, and if you go to some of the cemeteries in Kiev and Lvov and some of those places, there are a lot of Ukrainians that died in Chechnya, Abkhazia, and Ossetia. So they're very much going to these places just to kill Russians. And of course, the eastern part of Ukraine is completely different. So I don't know. That's a good question, and I think that's the whole point, though, is that they very much feel like they could be next, and I would tend to agree with them. I don't think it'll be little Azerbaijan, because I think Azerbaijan will stay sort of status quo, and that's okay. I mean, one thing we saw while we were there is that the Chechen diaspora, which used to be about 18,000 in Azerbaijan, is now down to about 2,000. And one of the reasons is because the men just keep disappearing. And what's happening is they just figure their best guess is that they're just basically feeding these guys slow at a time to appease the Russian security services who are after all these former Chechen fighters. And so one by one, they just disappear. And then they turn up being extradited, being killed in Chechnya or going to prison, and something's made of it on the Russian press or the Chechen press. But the Azeris are giving up their refugees, even those with political asylum. And I think they're just bowing to pressure. They're not giving them all up, but they're walking a really tough line right now. And so is Ukraine. Yes.
My name is Brad Masters. I'm a political science major. 2 questions. First of all, I know that Russia is one of the United States' principal allies with sort of to monitor the Iranians. First question is, how does our reaction towards Russia affect that relationship and that ally? Second is, the United States reaction towards Russia have an impact on, or one of the reasons why Russia has begun conducting naval operations with Venezuela and begun sort of doing some tricky things in that area?
Again, and I'll say I like Russia and I like Russians. I don't like Russian food, but I mean, more other than that, I mean, it's great. But it is we don't call it a superpower anymore. But Russia's on the verge of being one, whether we like it or not. I mean, and so we give ourselves great latitude being a superpower around the globe, and Russia's, I think, going to ask for the same latitude. So I think it will redefine our relations in the next 10 years. As far as, what was the first question, first part? Iran. Well, you can see the rhetoric, I mean, and the disengagement of different alliances and different military exercises and different things that I think these things will come back. I actually think it will be this whole conflict will be sort of fleeting between U.S. and Russia relations. But I just think that we need to start thinking that it's not just this Georgian thing, that it's wider than that. It is Ukraine. It is more of a sphere of influence thing. And so in that case, if more and more of those sort of political battles we run up against, I think our alliance will completely be strained. I mean, I don't know. I've always advocated a more direct link with Iran because I actually just feel like Russia and China go in the back door in Iran anyway, and we don't necessarily need them as an enemy, Iran. So I actually think we could maybe think about flip-flopping our whole strategy with the Persians, but that's another discussion with a lot of implications. But I don't know. As far as Venezuela goes, I mean, I'm sure Chavez is thrilled to death to have Russian ships maneuvering off the coast. I don't know. But again, we're in their sphere of influence. I mean, this is an old, in a way, a Cold War tactic. We kind of got in their neighborhood, they get in our neighborhood. I mean, they're in Cuba. But we almost, many people say we almost started World War III over Cuba, so, or nuclear, war over Cuba. So I don't know, and it's a good question. I don't know. Yeah. All these great questions. I can't answer a single one of them. But if anybody else has any, if they have the answer, please say no. I think it's fine.
I'm Drew Forbes, a European Studies major. I was wondering, with the mixed response coming from the West, are those EU monitors that they're trying to put in after things go back to status quo, are they going to be any more effective this time around? Because it doesn't seem like that's...
No, the monitors are not effective at all, and they never have been in that sense. They just are there to write stuff down and file it. And I don't mean that like that's a bad thing, but what it does is it gives Georgia some breathing room for Russia. Again, use Chechnya as an example because you can't you almost can't extract them from this conflict. EU monitors or OSCE monitors were put on the Georgian, Chechen-Russian border in the late 90s between the two wars because of all the Chechens that were coming across into the Pankisi Valley, another like only 40 miles from the Georgian capital, Tbilisi. Russia basically said, you stop the Shevardnadze, you stop the Chechens from coming in here or we'll take care of them ourselves. And Shevardnadze's like, no military incursions in here. And Russia's like, well, you better stop them. Shevardnadze's answer was to go to the OSCE, get this monitor mission. And all they did, and I did this with these guys, is walk up and down those mountainsides and just say, oh, we saw 6 Chechens, and write it down and send it off to some higher headquarters. But that was sort of an appeasement against it, so they did not want Russian troops entering Georgian soil. Again, when you see the monitors out here that are going to grab these parts. This thing works fast. Okay, not that fast. Well, shoot, now I got to go through this whole thing, I guess. So tricky. But if you looked at where those Russian positions were, right now it's remarkable that Saakashvili wanted to get rid of the Ossetian enclave, and now they'll just be happy if they can get the Russians back within the Ossetian enclave. So the monitors are actually there to monitor the Russians, and actually there from the Russian perspective to monitor the Georgians if the Georgians creep close to that area. So they're kind of effective and kind of not, because again they just are there to patrol those areas just to the east of that line and to the south of that line.
So do you think the Russians will actually go back to the status quo?
Yeah, they will. They're already doing it. And I think by October 1st, they probably will be pretty much out. I think Georgia, last week said that there was like 18 Russian positions, a total of like 500 Russians still in these areas. But again, part of Russia's job, and one of the reasons, after the hostilities ended on the 12th, they just went about ransacking the bases in Gori and Poti and scuttling ships and things like this. I mean, they really set Georgia's military back a long way, sending a distinct message, to Georgia, because it was all built up through the Ukrainian, Israeli, and U.S. arms transfers. But I think Russia will go back to status quo. As far as their positions, I don't think they'll go back to status quo numerically. I think it'll be quite a while before you see the numbers drop down to the pre-conflict numbers. You'll see thousands in Abkhazia, in Ossetia, rather than hundreds. That's my guess.
My name's David. I'm an international relations major. I was interested in North Abkhazia, North Ossetia. Mm-hmm. Is there separatist feeling there also against the Russians? Or what is the ultimate goal of the Ossetians? Is it an Ossetian state, or would they rather just be with Russia?
Well, that's one of the I'm glad you asked that question, because that's the one primary conflict that gets lost in the bigger conflict. Again, when you boil it right down, the Ossetians and the Georgians don't like each other, and they're fighting over this territory. So it's really wrong to say that Russia twisted anybody's arm. It's more, I think, accurate to say that Ossetia has a benefactor in Russia because their policies merge in this. The Ossetians want to be free of Georgia, and the Russians are happy to oblige them because they want to stick it to Georgia. As far as the Ossetians and separatists, I don't know. I've never felt nor heard of any separatist sort of feeling in North Ossetia. There was a lot of support on an individual level amongst North Ossetians for Chechen independence or Chechen separatism, or at least the war movement, but nothing official. So I don't know. It's a good question. As far as I know, the North Ossetian leader has sort of pretty much towed the Moscow line. Like most, again, they're only real separatists, but issues have been in Ossetia, a little bit in Ingushetia, and parts of Dagestan, which frame out to be sort of Muslim versus Christian on the northern border.
My name is Austin Walters. I'm a Russian and international relations major. I was in Moscow this summer studying the media, and there was a lot of talk during this conflict on the information wars, sort of correlated with this conflict. So I was wondering if you had any insight on that, how they affect or what their role was.
Well, one thing we didn't mention is Georgia was hit with a cyber attack that paralyzed most of the government systems during this war, and they're still, I guess, trying to sort that out. Information war. Information war, I mean, much like the U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine is, it's sort of like the bedrock of all your operations. And I think the Russians and Georgians are actually good at that as well. Of course, there's not a lot of independent media in Russia anymore. They've been clamping down on that for years. And so you saw a media that kind of, I thought, well, I'm not saying it supported, but it was enthralled with this new Russian move. It's interesting watching some of these reports, these Russian news reports. A bunch have been posted on YouTube. In fact, the one really interesting Russian report about this Chechen unit, and they talked with admiration about the Chechens, like these fierce fighters from our, southern land. These are the guys that were killing Russians like just a few years ago, which is really funny to me. But and they actually asked the Chechen, commander, are you doing this to support the Ossetians, or as part of, because they're fellow, whatever, And he's, no, this is all Russian military. Right down the line, we were given an order and we're doing it and stuff. But I think one of the more interesting media moments was when they took that lost American passport. Do you guys see that? They apparently there's a history teacher traveling through Moscow lost his passport in 2005. He noted that with Passport Authority. They issued him a new passport. He lost it in the back, I guess, on the flight in and out of Moscow. Well, that passport showed up in the InfoWars about a week after the war, and the Russians scanned that, put it on Russian press, and said this was captured. This is an American agent captured with Georgian Special Forces operations in Georgia. And again, who was this media message for? Well, again, Putin's really popular, played very well in Russia. Played very well. On the West, most people I saw said this is the dumbest thing ever, or he's the dumbest intelligence officer ever to leave his passport, so they didn't even be with one. Well, the guy actually lives in China, is teaching English in China right now. So there's enough checks and balances to see it was just a complete propaganda push. But I mean, the Russian media and the Russian people probably liked it. In the West, it was seen as kind of clunky and kind of dumb. But I don't know. Russian media is more or less, it's, at least there's strong oversight by the government. So, and again, there's animosity. I mean, Georgian and Russian peoples. I mean, the Georgians are very proud people, and I think that's been a thorn in the side. They want independence. They want to be free from Russia, and they don't make any bones about that. So I think even there's a little ethnic or racial, not hatred, but there's some racial issues going on between Georgians and Russia within the Russian sphere. So I think most Russians are probably happy, and the media conveyed that message. So, but you'll see the media fighting now because again, Georgia's saying they killed Russians are saying they killed 3,000 Georgian military personnel. Like that's 10 times the official Georgian figure. Again, it's just information warfare. That's it. We have to go. Thank you very much for coming out today. I hope I answered some question or at least raised a few good ones. So thank you.